He had 4 weeks left to live. Maybe less. 12 doctors couldn't tell you why. 4 private physicians. Centuries of vampire medicine between them. And not one of them could explain why the great Augustus Ashworth, father of a vampire king, was fading a little more every single day. Then his son did something nobody expected. He didn't hire another doctor. He hired a cook. A broke, blacklisted, desperate cook with nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. 3 weeks later, she'd found what an entire team of physicians missed in a year. And that discovery made her a target, because someone in that house wanted the old man dead, and they were willing to kill anyone who got in the way, including her. This is the story of the woman a vampire king hired to save his dying father, and how, without meaning to, she ended up saving them both and rewriting her own broken life in the process. But 3 weeks before any of that, before the poison, before the vampire king, before any of it, she was just a woman about to lose everything. Wren Callahan had not cried in 14 months, not because grief had run dry, but because she had trained herself out of it the way you train yourself out of any expensive habit. Crying did not pay rent. Crying did not cover her sister's dialysis co-pays. Crying certainly did not undo the small, devastating line that now sat permanently in her professional file. The one that followed her from agency to agency like a shadow with teeth. Negligence contributing to patient decline. 6 words. 6 words that had taken a 14-year career built on gentleness and precision and turned it into ash in the span of a single hospital review board meeting. She had been a private chef for the terminally ill, a specialist in the strange, tender art of cooking for people whose bodies were quietly shutting down, who could no longer digest what the rest of the world ate without pain, who needed food reimagined as medicine, as memory, as one last small mercy. She had fed men who no longer remembered their own children's names, but who wept at the smell of her cornbread because it reminded them of a mother 40 years gone. She had spent a decade learning how to coax appetite back into people who had already made peace with starving. And then Mr. Whitfield had died on a Tuesday afternoon in March. An 89-year-old man with a heart that had been failing for years, a man whose own physicians had given him 6 weeks and who had lived 4 months longer than anyone expected under Wren's care. His family, blindsided by grief and looking for somewhere to put it, had found her. They said the broth was too rich. They said she had ignored dietary restrictions. They said, in the quiet, clinical language of a formal complaint, that his death had come faster than it should have, and that she was the reason why. The hospital's internal review had eventually cleared her of any real wrongdoing, had found nothing but an old man's heart, finally stopping the way old hearts do. But clearance does not erase a rumor. The note stayed in her file. The agencies stopped calling. Word moved through the tight, gossiping world of private care work faster than any formal record ever could. And within 2 months, Wren Callahan, once one of the most requested palliative chefs on the Eastern Seaboard, could not get hired to reheat soup in a nursing home cafeteria. She was 31 years old, buried under debt that was not even hers, and running out of places to hide from it. The debt belonged to her sister, technically. Ivy was 26, had been born with a kidney condition that had worsened steadily since childhood and had spent the last 3 years cycling in and out of dialysis while insurance fought every claim like it was a personal insult. Wren had signed papers she barely understood in the terrified fog of watching her sister nearly die twice, had co-signed loans and medical credit lines with an optimism that felt, in hindsight, almost criminally naive. She had believed, at the time, that her career was stable enough to absorb the weight. She had been wrong. Now the weight was crushing her. Slowly. The way debt always crushes people. Not with a single blow, but with 1,000 small ones. A phone call here, a letter there, a credit score dropping by degrees until it barely registered as a number that meant anything at all. She was 2 weeks from losing the small apartment she shared with no one, having let her roommate go months ago when she could no longer split the rent evenly, when the email arrived. It came from an address she did not recognize, a domain that resolved to nothing. When she searched it, sent from an agency called Aldergate Placement Services that had no reviews, no public staff directory, no history she could find anywhere online. The message was short: private culinary and care position available. Live-in. Compensation significantly above market rate. Immediate start. Discretion required. Prior experience with palliative or geriatric care essential. If interested, respond with availability for an interview within 48 hours. Every instinct she had built over a decade of professional caution told her this was the kind of email you deleted. No address, no employer name, no verifiable references requested from her, which was strange in itself, since usually she was the one being vetted within an inch of her life before anyone let her near a vulnerable patient. But desperation has a way of quieting instinct, and Wren had exactly $1,400 left in her checking account and a rent payment due in 12 days that was more than double that. She replied within the hour. The interview, when it came, was unlike anything she had experienced in 14 years of private care work. There was no video call, no office visit, no casual coffee meeting to feel out compatibility the way most families did before letting a stranger into their home. Instead, a car arrived outside her apartment at exactly the time specified. A long black vehicle with windows so darkly tinted they looked less like glass and more like still water, driven by a man in an impeccably tailored grey suit, who introduced himself only as Mr. Voss, and who said almost nothing else for the entire drive. They left the city behind within 20 minutes, the buildings thinning into suburbs and then into forest, the road narrowing and climbing until the trees pressed close on either side, like the walls of a corridor. Wren watched the world go by in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and told herself that if this turned out to be some elaborate scheme to rob or hurt her, at least her sister would get the life insurance payout that Wren had, in a moment of dark practicality 2 years ago, quietly taken out on herself. The estate appeared out of the mist the way old money always seems to, suddenly and completely, as if it had simply always been there, and the world had only just caught up to noticing it. Iron gates taller than the car itself swung open without anyone touching them. A drive of pale gravel wound through ground so meticulously kept, they looked almost unnatural, hedges trimmed into geometric perfection, a fountain standing dry and silent in a courtyard ringed with black stone urns. The house itself rose up out of the fog, like something built by people who had never once in their lives worried about money. A sprawling structure of dark granite and soaring windows, a Gothic in its bones, but updated somewhere along the way with the kind of understated modern luxury that Wren had only ever seen in magazines. It should have felt welcoming. It did not. It felt like walking toward the mouth of something very old and very patient. She was met at the entrance not by the man who had hired her, whoever that turned out to be, but by a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Ashworth's estate manager, though she did not offer a first name, only the surname Colley, spoken with the clipped precision of someone who had said it 10,000 times and expected it to be remembered on the first try. Mrs. Colley was tall and narrow and dressed entirely in charcoal, her grey hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, and she looked Wren over with an expression that was not unkind exactly, but was assessing in a way that made Wren feel like a piece of equipment being inspected for defects before purchase. "You will be interviewed by the head of the household directly," Mrs. Colley said, leading her through a foyer with ceilings so high. Wren's neck ached looking up at them. He does not conduct interviews often. Consider it a significant courtesy that he is doing so at all. Wren did not ask who he was. Something in the woman's tone told her the answer would come, whether she asked for it or not. She was shown into a study lined floor to ceiling with books, the kind of room that smelled like old paper and leather and something faintly metallic underneath that Wren could not place, and told to wait. She had perhaps 4 minutes alone in that room. 4 minutes to notice the complete absence of family photographs anywhere, the strange fact that every window was fitted with heavy black curtains, despite the fact that it was barely 3 in the afternoon, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop the longer she sat there, as though the walls themselves were slowly exhaling cold. The door opened without a sound. The man who entered was, Wren would think later, the single most unsettling person she had ever been in a room with, and she would spend a long time trying to articulate exactly why, because it was not that he looked frightening in any obvious sense. He was, if anything, beautiful in a way that seemed almost designed to disarm suspicion. Tall and dark-haired, dressed in a black suit so precisely tailored it looked less like clothing and more like a second skin. His features sharp and aristocratic in a way that belonged on the cover of a history book about some vanished European dynasty. But his eyes were wrong. Not in color, though they were an unusually pale gray that seemed to catch the dim light and hold it. Wrong in stillness. He did not blink the way people blink. He did not shift his weight the way people do when they stand for long periods. He simply existed in the space, motionless and watchful, the way a photograph of a man might exist, rather than the man himself. "Miss Callahan," he said, and his voice was low and even, carrying an old-world formality that did not match his apparent age at all. "Thank you for making the journey on such short notice." "I wasn't given much information about the position," Wren said, and was pleased to hear that her voice came out steady, despite the way her pulse had picked up the moment he entered the room. "Nothing about the family, nothing about the patient." "That was intentional," he said, moving to stand behind the large desk that dominated the room, though he did not sit, only rested one hand against its dark wood surface. "My name is Damien Ashworth. I am seeking someone to prepare meals and provide daily care for my father, Augustus. He is elderly, he is unwell, and he has, over the past several months, grown increasingly difficult to feed." "Difficult how?" Wren asked, and felt herself sliding, almost against her will, into the familiar rhythm of a professional intake. The questions that 14 years of practice had worn into muscle memory. What's his diagnosis? Is he under a physician's care currently? What's he been able to tolerate? And what's triggering refusal? Something in Damien Ashworth's expression shifted, very slightly. Something that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of approval, though his face settled back into its careful neutrality so quickly, Wren almost doubted she had seen it at all. His physicians have struggled to agree on a diagnosis, Damien said. He is old. His body is failing, in the way that bodies fail. He refuses. Most food that is brought to him has lost a significant amount of weight in recent months and has become, according to his current staff, largely unresponsive to attempts at care. I am told his previous chef left the position out of what she described as an inability to reach him at all. Wren considered this. And you think a stranger is going to succeed where someone who's presumably been with him longer has failed? I think, Damien said. And here his pale eyes settled fully on her face for the first time, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her absolutely refuse to. I think my father does not need someone familiar. He needs someone who has not yet learned to give up on him. Your file, Miss Callahan, before it was tarnished by people looking for someone to blame for an old man's natural death, described a woman who kept patients eating and engaged. By every account I was able to gather, genuinely cared for, well past the point when most professionals in your field would have stopped trying. That is precisely what my father requires. I am not interested in your recent history. I am interested in what you were capable of before it. The words landed somewhere deep in Wren's chest, a place that had been bruised and defensive for over a year, and she had to look down at her hands for a moment to keep her composure. It was the first time in 14 months that anyone had looked at her ruined professional reputation and seen past it rather than stopping cold at the surface of it. The compensation, Damien continued, before she could formulate a response, will be $40,000 per month. Live-in, with full medical benefits extended to you and, I understand from my research, to your sister as well. For the duration of your employment, you will have a private suite in the East Wing. Your responsibilities will be exclusively my father's meals and his general daily well-being. You will not be asked to perform any other domestic duties. In exchange, I will require complete discretion regarding this household, its members, and anything you observe here, formalized through a legal agreement, and I will require that you not leave the estate grounds without prior notice to Mrs. Colley, for reasons of both privacy and, frankly, your own safety. Wren's mind had gone somewhat blank at the number, had to consciously drag itself back to the rest of the sentence to process what he had actually said. Safety? She repeated. From what? This house has enemies, Damien said simply. The way another man might comment on the weather. My family has held considerable influence in this region for a very long time, and influence of that magnitude attracts resentment. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because I would rather you understand the terms fully before you accept them. She should have asked more questions. She would think later about all the questions she should have asked in that moment, about family disputes and inheritance and the strange, bloodless quality of the light in that room, and the way Mrs. Colley's hands had been cold as stone when they briefly touched during the tour. but $40,000 a month was more than triple what she had ever earned, even at the height of her career. And it was the difference between her sister living and her sister not living, calculated in a way that was almost obscenely simple once you reduced it down to numbers on a page. She would have signed almost anything. "I'll need to see the agreement before I commit to anything," she said, because some professional instinct still demanded she at least perform due diligence. "And I'd like to meet your father before I accept, if that's possible. I don't take positions blind. I need to know what I'm walking into." "That," Damien said, and something in his face eased slightly, as though her caution had itself been a kind of reassurance to him, "is a reasonable request. Come with me." He led her not back through the grand foyer, but through a side corridor, narrower and dimmer, the black curtains here replaced with heavy velvet drapes, the color of dried blood. And Wren found herself cataloguing details, the way she had trained herself to, during a decade of walking into strangers' homes and strangers' grief, the complete absence of any mirrors anywhere in the house, the way the staff they passed, a handful of quiet figures in dark uniforms, all moved with the same unnatural, gliding silence that Mrs. Colley had. The cold that seemed to radiate not from drafts or air conditioning but from the walls themselves, as though the house had never once, in its long existence, been properly warm. They stopped outside a set of tall double doors at the end of the corridor, and Damien paused there, with his hand resting against the wood, not yet opening it. "He can be difficult," Damien said quietly. And for the first time since she had met him, something in his composure cracked slightly, revealing underneath it something raw and tired that had clearly been carried for a very long time. "He does not always recognize visitors. He has good days and very bad ones. I need you to understand that whatever happens in this room in the next few minutes is not a reflection of whether you are right for this position. I simply need you to see him as he is before you decide." Wren nodded, and something about the plea underneath his careful formality, the genuine fear in a man who otherwise seemed carved from stone, softened something in her that 14 months of bitterness had hardened. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready." Damien opened the door. The room beyond was enormous, dominated by a bed so large it looked almost like a small ship anchored in the center of the space, hung with heavy curtains that had been pulled back to reveal the man lying within it. Augustus Ashworth had clearly once been a formidable figure, broad-shouldered and tall even lying down, with the same sharp aristocratic bones that marked his son's face. But whatever illness had taken hold of him had stripped away everything else. His skin had a grayish, papery quality that reminded Wren uncomfortably of the final weeks she had spent with Mr. Whitfield. That particular translucence that comes when a body has simply stopped absorbing what it needs to sustain itself. His eyes, when they opened at the sound of the door, were the same pale gray as his son's, but clouded at the edges, unfocused, drifting. "Damien," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp of what must once have been a rich, commanding baritone. "Have you come to finish the argument?" "There is no argument, Father," Damien said, and his voice had gone gentle in a way that transformed him entirely, stripped away the cold, formal authority Wren had met in the study, and replaced it with something achingly tender. "I've brought someone to meet you. Her name is Wren." Augustus's clouded eyes drifted toward her, focused with visible effort, And for a moment, Wren saw something flicker there, some ember of the sharp, intelligent man he must once have been, fighting up through whatever fog had settled over him. "Another one," he said. And there was a weary, bitter humor in it. "How many is that now, Damien? 4? 5? They come in smelling of fear and leave within the month. I don't blame them. I wouldn't stay in this house either, if I had anywhere else to go." "I'm not afraid," Wren said, before she had fully decided to speak, and both men turned to look at her with matching expressions of surprise. It was true, she realized, as she said it. She was not afraid of the strange cold house or the staff who moved like they didn't quite touch the floor, or even the sharp-eyed son who had just offered her more money than she'd made in the last 3 years combined. Sick old men did not frighten her. She had spent a decade in rooms just like this one, had learned that beneath the fear and the anger and the exhaustion of dying, there was almost always just a person, tired and lonely and hungry for someone to see them as more than a diagnosis. "I've spent most of my career with people like you, Mr. Ashworth," she continued, moving closer to the bed, despite Damien's slight, involuntary tension beside her. "People who've stopped eating because eating feels like admitting something they're not ready to admit. I'm not here to force anything down your throat. I'm just here to cook. If you don't want to eat what I make, that's your business. But I promise you, it'll smell good enough that you might change your mind." There was a long silence, and for a terrible moment, Wren thought she had overstepped, had been too casual, too familiar with a man she had known for less than 60 seconds in a house she did not understand. Then Augustus Ashworth laughed, a dry, cracked sound that clearly cost him effort, but a laugh nonetheless. And beside her she felt Damien's shoulders drop half an inch. Some held tension finally releasing. "I like her," Augustus said, his clouded eyes still on Wren's face. "She has spine. Better than the last one, who cried the first time. I told her the soup tasted like dishwater. Damien, hire this one before she comes to her senses and runs from this mausoleum while she still can." "I intend to," Damien said, and when he glanced sideways at Wren, there was something in his expression she could not quite name, something that sat uneasily between relief and a kind of careful, guarded hope. The look of a man who had stopped expecting good things to happen in his own house and did not entirely trust himself to believe in one now. She signed the agreement that evening in a smaller study off the main library, a stack of papers thick enough that any lawyer would have told her to take it home and review it for a week before committing to anything. She read as much as her exhausted brain could absorb, noted clauses about confidentiality that seemed excessive even for a private family, noted the complete absence of any standard employment protections she would have expected, noted a line buried in the middle of page 11 that stated compensation would continue in full for the duration of her contract, regardless of the patient's condition or outcome, a clause so unusual it made her pause and reread it twice. She signed. Anyway, Ivy's next round of treatment was due in 9 days, and this was the only lifeline that had appeared in 14 months of drowning. Her suite in the East Wing was, she had to admit, extraordinary, larger than her entire apartment back in the city, furnished with an antique elegance that made her feel simultaneously pampered and like she had wandered into a museum exhibit she was not supposed to touch. The kitchen she would be working from was a floor below, a sprawling professional space that put every restaurant kitchen she had ever worked in to shame, stocked with equipment still gleaming and unused, as though it had been purchased specifically for her, and had never once been touched by another cook's hands. That first night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar heavy silence of the house, Wren wandered down to that kitchen sometime past midnight, drawn by the old habit of needing to touch and understand a space before she could feel settled in it. She was running her hand along the marble countertop, mapping the layout in the dark, when she became aware that she was not alone. Damien Ashworth stood in the doorway, still in the same black suit he had worn that afternoon, as though he had not changed, or she found herself thinking with a small, uneasy jolt, as though he did not need to sleep at all. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, though he made no move to leave. "You didn't," Wren lied, one hand still pressed flat against the cool marble to steady the sudden lurch of her heartbeat. "I don't sleep well in new places. Occupational hazard, I suppose. You spend enough years in strangers' houses. You never quite relax in any of them." He was quiet for a moment, watching her with that unsettling stillness. And then he said, unexpectedly, "My father was a great man once. Before whatever this is took hold of him, he built half of what my family still holds today. He raised me largely alone after my mother died, and he did it with more patience than I deserved." Watching him fade like this, watching him refuse the most basic sustenance day after day, and being unable to determine why, has been the longest year of my existence. Wren studied him, this strange, cold, beautiful man standing motionless in her doorway at midnight, speaking with a raw honesty that seemed to cost him something significant to offer, and felt the last of her professional wariness soften just slightly further. "I'll do everything I can for him," she said. "That's a promise, not a performance. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." Something moved across Damien's face, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully read it. "I believe you," he said, quietly. "Good night, Miss Callahan." "Wren," she corrected. "If I'm going to be living in your house and cooking for your father, you can use my first name." "Wren," he repeated, testing the shape of it. And there was something in the way he said it, low and careful, like he was handling something breakable, that stayed with her long after he had disappeared back down the dark corridor, and she was left alone in the vast, silent kitchen, wondering exactly what kind of house she had just agreed to live in. She began the following morning before dawn, moving through the enormous kitchen with the particular focused calm that had always come to her in these spaces, the one part of her life that had never felt uncertain even when everything else did. She reviewed what little medical information had been provided, a thin folder assembled by Mrs. Colley that listed Augustus's known symptoms without ever quite committing to a diagnosis: weight loss, tremors in the hands, a persistent low fever that never broke into anything definitive, a growing confusion that came and went unpredictably, worse some days than others, in a pattern that did not match any dementia progression. Wren had studied over the years of working adjacent to hospice care. She noted, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned to read illness the way other people read weather, that none of it quite added up to any single clean explanation. She started simply, the way she always did with a new patient, with food that required almost no digestive effort and carried maximum comfort, a delicate bone broth simmered slowly with herbs chosen more for scent than nutrition, since scent was so often the thing that reached people before appetite did. She carried the tray up herself rather than sending it with the household staff, wanting to be present for that first reaction, to watch and adjust, in real time, the way she always had with her most difficult cases. Augustus was propped up against a mountain of pillows when she entered, looking marginally more alert than he had the previous afternoon, his clouded eyes tracking her across the room with something that might have been curiosity. "The spine girl returns," he said, and there was less bitterness in it today, more genuine interest. "What poison have you brought me this morning?" "Bone broth," Wren said, setting the tray carefully across his lap and settling into the chair beside the bed, rather than hovering the way she suspected previous staff had, standing at attention, waiting to be dismissed. "Rosemary, thyme, a little bit of lemon. Nothing that should sit hard on your stomach. You don't have to finish it. You don't even have to like it. But I'd appreciate it if you at least told me why. If you don't." Augustus regarded the bowl with visible suspicion for a long moment, and then, to Wren's quiet surprise, lifted the spoon himself rather than waiting to be fed, and took a small, careful sip. It was silent for a moment while he considered it, and Wren found herself holding her breath in a way she had not done for a patient in over a year, some old instinct reawakening after months of dormancy. "It's good," Augustus said finally, sounding almost personally offended by the admission. "Better than good. When did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother," Wren said, relaxing slightly as she watched him take a second spoonful without prompting. "She raised me and my sister after our parents passed. She used to say that food was the only language that worked on people who'd stopped listening to everything else. Grief, fear, anger. None of it can fully drown out the smell of something good simmering on a stove. It gets through, even when words can't." Augustus was quiet, working through another spoonful with what looked like real, if cautious, appetite. And then he said, unexpectedly, "She sounds like she understood people." "She did," Wren said softly. "I try to live up to that." "You're succeeding," Augustus said, and finished nearly the entire bowl before exhaustion visibly overtook him and he sank back against the pillows, breathing slightly labored. But his color, Wren thought, looking fractionally better than it had the previous day. She would learn, over the following days, that this pattern held with remarkable consistency. Augustus ate for her in a way he apparently had not eaten for anyone else in months. Small, careful portions, but steady ones. Day after day, his appetite improving incrementally in a way that made Mrs. Colley regard Wren with something that shifted slowly from suspicion into a grudging, wary respect. She learned his rhythms, learned that mornings were his clearest hours, and that confusion tended to settle in as the day wore toward evening. Learned that he liked to talk while she cooked in the small kitchenette she had set up adjacent to his room specifically, so he would not have to eat food that had traveled any distance and gone cold or lost its coaxing scent along the way. She learned, too, about the family, in the fragmented, meandering way that old men tell stories when their minds drift between decades. Augustus had built the family's considerable fortune not through the private equity and real estate holdings that formed its public face, but through something he referred to only obliquely, in careful roundabout language, as the old business conducted in the shadows of the same city where his son now ran things by daylight through Croft, adjacent, legitimate fronts, though he never once used the word that Wren was slowly, uneasily, beginning to suspect, described his family more accurately than any business title could. He spoke of a wife, long dead, Damien's mother, with a tenderness that made Wren's chest ache. He spoke, more rarely, and with a visible caution that suggested old wounds not yet healed, of a nephew named Silas, Augustus's own brother's son, a man Augustus described in careful, guarded terms as ambitious and clever, and not to be trusted with anything of real value. "He came to see me last month," Augustus said one evening, roughly 2 weeks into Wren's employment, his voice slower than usual, his eyes drifting somewhere past her shoulder toward memories she could not follow. "Silas brought me a gift, said it would help with my strength. I didn't want it. Damien doesn't know I took it anyway. Just to be polite. Just to keep the peace in this house a little longer." Wren's hands had gone still over the small pan of custard she had been preparing, some old professional instinct sharpening to full alertness. "What gift, Mr. Ashworth?" "A tonic," Augustus murmured, his eyelids growing heavy, the conversation slipping away from him the way it often did in the later hours. "Family recipe," he called it. "Very old. Very traditional, tasted like copper and rot. I only had a little. Didn't want to be rude. Do you remember when that was?" Wren pressed gently, keeping her voice light and unhurried, even as something cold had begun to coil tight in her stomach. "Was it before or after you started feeling worse?" But Augustus had already drifted, his breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of sleep, and Wren sat beside his bed for a long while afterward, the custard forgotten and cooling on the stovetop below, turning the word tonic over and over in her mind. Like a stone, she could not quite identify the shape of. Some instinct she had honed over a decade of watching illness up close, whispering that whatever Silas Ashworth had brought his uncle had not been a gift at all. She did not mention it to Damien that night. It felt, somehow, too fragile a thing to hand over without more to support it. A single slurred sentence from a man whose mind slipped in and out of decades like water through cupped hands. She had learned, over the years, the particular danger of alarming a family based on a half-formed suspicion, had seen how quickly panic could curdle into blame, how easily a frightened son might turn that fear on the person standing closest to the bed rather than the truth hiding somewhere further off. So she filed it away instead, the way she filed away everything that did not yet make sense, and kept watching. What she noticed over the following days was this. Augustus was better in the mornings, almost without exception, alert and hungry and willing to talk. His color improved, his hands steadier around the spoon. By early afternoon something would shift, subtly at first and then more pronounced, a fog rolling back in behind his eyes, his words beginning to slur and drift, his appetite for the midday meal noticeably weaker than it had been for breakfast. It was not, she realized slowly, a pattern that matched the natural rhythm of illness, the general fatigue that builds through a day and peaks toward evening. It was too sharp, too consistent, too precisely timed to something, rather than simply following the body's own exhaustion. She began, without telling anyone what she was doing, to track it properly, the way she had once tracked reactions and triggers for every difficult case in her long career, a small notebook kept tucked in the pocket of her apron, noting what he ate, when, how he responded, what visitors came and went from his room, what medications the household's private physician, a quiet, nervous man named Dr. Renner, who visited twice weekly and seemed peculiarly reluctant to commit to any firm diagnosis, administered, and when. It was on the 5th day of keeping that notebook that she first met Silas Ashworth in person. She was carrying a tray down the east corridor toward Augustus's room, mid-afternoon. The fog she had come to dread already visibly settling over the old man from her last visit an hour before, when a man stepped out of the shadowed alcove near the grand staircase with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who has never once in his life needed to move quickly for anyone. He was younger than Damien, or appeared to be, though Wren had already begun to suspect that appeared to be meant very little in this house. Dressed in an ash-grey suit that fit him with the same impossible precision as everything else she had seen here. His hair a lighter brown than his cousin's, his features handsome in a sharper, more calculating way, missing entirely the raw, guarded warmth that occasionally broke through Damien's careful composure. "You must be the new cook," he said, his voice pleasant, almost warm, in a way that immediately set every instinct in Wren's body on alert. The particular wariness she had developed over years of reading people who wanted something from her before they had said a single honest word. "Silas Ashworth. Augustus is my uncle. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Wren Callahan," she said, keeping the tray balanced carefully, and her expression carefully neutral. "I'd shake your hand, but I've got my hands full at the moment." "Of course," Silas said, his pale eyes, a shade lighter than either Damien's or Augustus's, drifting down toward the tray with an interest that seemed slightly too focused to be simple curiosity. "Broth again? My uncle used to eat like a king, you know. Whole roasted meats, rich sauces, the finest of everything money could buy. It's rather sad to see him reduced to invalid food. He requires food that's gentle on his system right now," Wren said evenly. "That's not a reflection of what he used to enjoy. It's a reflection of what his body can currently handle." "Of course," Silas said again, and smiled in a way that did not reach his pale eyes at all. "You know, I brought him something myself, not long ago, a tonic from an old family recipe meant to restore vitality. I do hope he's been taking it regularly. It would be such a shame for a gift like that to go to waste." The word tonic landed in Wren's chest like a struck bell, and she was careful, very careful, to keep her face perfectly still, to let nothing of the sudden sharpening of her attention show through. "I'll be sure to ask him about it," she said pleasantly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, this needs to reach him while it's still warm." Silas stepped aside with an exaggerated little bow, and as she passed him, she felt his pale eyes tracking her the entire length of the corridor, a physical sensation like a hand pressed flat against her back, and did not fully release the tension in her shoulders until she had turned the corner and put a solid wall between herself and his gaze. That evening, once the household had settled into the particular hush that seemed to fall over the estate after dark, Wren found Damien in the library, exactly where Mrs. Colley had told her he could usually be found in the late hours, a glass of something dark and untouched, sitting beside a stack of papers. He did not appear to actually be reading. "I need to ask you something," Wren said, closing the door behind her, and something in her tone must have carried the weight of it, because Damien set down the pen he had been holding immediately, his full attention shifting to her with an intensity that still, 3 weeks into this strange employment, made her pulse quicken slightly. "What is it?" he said. "Is my father all right?" "He's fine. For now," Wren said, and pulled the small notebook from her apron pocket, setting it on the desk between them. But I think something's wrong. And I don't think it's the kind of wrong his doctor's been looking for. I've been tracking his condition since I started. He's noticeably better in the mornings and noticeably worse by afternoon, every single day, consistently enough that I don't think it's just the natural progression of an illness. And your father mentioned, a couple weeks ago, that your cousin brought him some kind of tonic, a family recipe, he called it. Said he only took a little of it, out of politeness. I ran into Silas myself today, and he brought it up unprompted. Asked whether your father had been taking it regularly. It felt like he wanted me to know about it, like he wanted it on the record that it had been offered. Damien had gone very still. The particular stillness Wren had learned to recognize now as something more than simple, calm, a controlled and dangerous quiet that settled over him when something had genuinely alarmed him. "Show me," he said, nodding toward the notebook, and Wren slid it across the desk, watching his pale eyes move down the careful columns of dates and times and symptoms she had been recording, watching his jaw tighten by degrees as he worked through what she had assembled. "This is thorough," he said finally, looking up at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Something that sat between gratitude and a kind of dawning, furious dread. "No physician has documented anything like this. Renner has been treating my father for months and has given us nothing but vague theories about age and decline. Renner might not be looking for the right thing," Wren said carefully. "Or he might not be allowed to." Damien's eyes sharpened on her face. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Wren said. "I'm telling you what I've observed, and I'm telling you I think it's worth finding out exactly what was in that tonic. If your father's only had a little of it, and he's still declining on this kind of schedule, either it's still in his system doing something, or there's something else happening that hasn't been accounted for at all. I've seen a lot of dying patients in my career, Mr. Ashworth. I've never seen one decline on a clock like this." Damien rose from behind the desk, moving to the window and staring out at the dark grounds beyond it for a long, silent moment. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and controlled in a way that made the hair on Wren's arms rise. "My cousin has wanted a greater share of this family's holdings since we were children," he said quietly. "My father has always kept him at arm's length, has never fully trusted him with the responsibilities Silas believes he's owed. If something were to happen to my father, certain protections currently in place would shift. Certain decisions I have made regarding the family's future, decisions Silas has fought against for years, would become vulnerable to challenge in ways they currently are not." "You think he's trying to kill his own uncle," Wren said. The words, feeling strange and heavy in her mouth, even as some part of her had already known, from the moment Silas had smiled at her in that corridor, that this was exactly where the thread was leading. "I think," Damien said, turning back to face her, his pale eyes catching the low light of the room, in a way that made them look, for just a moment, almost luminous, "that I would be a fool not to consider it seriously, given everything you've just shown me. And I think, Wren, that you have done in 3 weeks what an entire team of physicians and household staff failed to do in the better part of a year. I owe you a debt. I'm not certain I know how to repay." "You don't owe me anything," Wren said, a little unsteadily, unused to being looked at with quite that much raw, unguarded gratitude. "I just did my job." "You did considerably more than your job," Damien said, and crossed the room to stand closer to her than he had before. close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, close enough that she could feel the particular chill that seemed to radiate from him even through the space between them. "I would like your help, if you're willing to give it, not simply feeding my father, though that has already meant more to him and to me than you likely realize. I would like your help finding out exactly what my cousin gave him, and exactly what it's doing to him. You have an eye for detail that none of my own people possess. You notice what the rest of us have trained ourselves not to see." Ren studied his face for a long moment. This strange, cold, beautiful man, who had, over 3 short weeks, become something she had not expected him to become. Someone whose good opinion had started to matter to her in ways that unsettled her more than the house's unnatural silences or the staff who moved like ghosts, and felt something in her chest settle into a decision she suspected she had already made, without fully realizing it. "Okay," she said, "but if we're doing this properly, I need access to whatever's left of that tonic, if there's any left at all, and I need you to be honest with me about what exactly I'm dealing with in this house, Mr. Ashworth. I've spent 3 weeks pretending not to notice things that don't add up. The staff who don't seem to eat. The way your father talks about the old business like it's something out of a history book he lived through personally rather than heard about secondhand. The fact that I have never once, in 3 weeks, seen your reflection in the mirror in the East Wing hallway, though I've walked past it beside you twice." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Ren thought, for one uncertain moment, that she had finally pushed too far, said the one thing that would end whatever fragile trust had been building between them these past weeks. But Damien's expression did not close off the way she had braced for. Instead, something in it seemed almost to loosen, some final held breath releasing. "You're very observant, Ren Callahan," he said quietly. "I've been waiting to see how long it would take you to say it out loud." "Then say it back," Ren said, her heart hammering now in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange, electric weight of the moment. "Tell me what you are." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face as though looking for some sign of the fear he clearly expected to find, and was, she thought, half braced against, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone very soft, almost gentle. The voice of a man laying down something fragile and dangerous, and hoping it would not shatter in the process. "I am the head of a family that has existed in the shadows of this region for longer than any record you could find would suggest," he said. "My father built what we hold today, and what we hold, and what we are, is not something either of us was born understanding, the way ordinary families understand their inheritance. I am not human, Ren. I have not been human for a very long time. Neither is my father, though what is happening to him now, whatever Silas has done, is stripping that from him faster than either of us fully understands. And if we do not find out what it is and stop it, I believe it will kill him in truth, not merely weaken him. He is not simply dying of old age. Vampires of his lineage do not die of old age at all, not unless something forces the process." The words sat in the room between them, vampire, spoken so plainly and so quietly that it took Ren several long seconds to fully absorb it, to reconcile it against 3 weeks of small, strange details her rational mind had been carefully, deliberately explaining away. The cold that radiated from every surface in this house, the staff who never seemed to eat, drink, or tire, Augustus's clouded eyes and the strange metallic quality that had clung faintly to the tonic he had described. Tasted like copper and rot, he had said, and Wren had filed the phrase away without letting herself follow it to its obvious, impossible conclusion. She should, by every rational measure, have been afraid. She found, standing in that dim library, with this strange, still man, watching her with a caution that looked almost like fear of his own, that she was not. "Does it matter?" she said slowly, testing the question as she asked it. "Whether your father is human or not, if he's dying, and I can help him." Something in Damien's face broke open entirely at that. Some final wall coming down that she suspected had been standing for a very long time, and he reached out, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wanted to, and brushed a single strand of hair back from her face with fingers that were exactly as she had expected them to be, cold as stone and impossibly gentle. "No," he said quietly. "It does not matter to you at all, does it? I have met 3 centuries of humans who would have run from this room the moment I said the word aloud, and you are standing here asking me how you can help instead." "I don't scare easily," Wren said, her voice steadier than she felt, though she did not step back from his touch. "I told you that the first day. I meant it." "I am beginning to understand," Damien said softly, "that you meant a great many things you said, more thoroughly than most people ever mean anything at all." And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the strange, charged silence between them stretching until it felt like something almost tangible. A held breath neither wanted to release first. It was Mrs. Colley's brisk knock at the library door that finally broke it, her voice muffled but urgent through the heavy wood. "Mr. Ashworth, your father is asking for the cook. He says it's urgent." Damien's hand fell away from Wren's face immediately, his expression shifting back into the controlled formality she had first met 3 weeks ago, though something warmer lingered underneath it now, something that had not been there before tonight. "Go to him," he said. "We'll continue this conversation. I promise you that. But my father comes first. Always." "That's exactly what I'd expect you to say," Wren said, and found, as she hurried from the room toward Augustus's wing, that she meant it as the compliment it was, that somewhere in these 3 strange cold weeks she had come, without entirely meaning to trust this family in a way she had not trusted anyone since her grandmother had died, and left her responsible for a sister, and a debt, and a career she had built entirely alone. She found Augustus more agitated than she had yet seen him, sitting upright against his pillows with a wild, unfocused energy in his clouded eyes, his hands trembling against the blankets in a way that went beyond his usual afternoon fog into something sharper and more frightened. "Mr. Ashworth," Wren said, moving quickly to his bedside. "What's wrong? What do you need?" "The tonic," Augustus rasped, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man so weakened, his eyes finding hers with sudden, desperate clarity. "Silas came again today. While you were with Damien, he said I needed another dose, said it would help. I didn't want to take it, Wren, I didn't, but he wouldn't leave until I did. And now I feel very strange. I feel like something is pulling at me from the inside, like there is a hand closed around my heart, squeezing, slowly." Wren's blood ran cold. "How long ago?" she said, already reaching for the small emergency kit she had insisted on keeping in the room since her first week. Some old professional instinct screaming that whatever was happening now required speed. She did not yet fully understand how to provide. "How long ago did he give it to you?" "Not long," Augustus whispered, his breathing growing visibly labored, his grip on her wrist weakening even as she watched. "Wren, find Damien. Please, I don't think I have very much time left." "Stay with me," Wren said, forcing her voice into the calm, level register she had spent a decade perfecting in exactly these moments. The tone that told a frightened patient, someone competent, was in the room even when her own heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "I'm not leaving you to go find him. I'm going to call for him. Look at me. Keep looking at me." She hit the small brass bell on the bedside table twice in rapid succession, the signal she had established in her first week for genuine emergencies, and then turned back to Augustus, taking in every detail she could with the focused, clinical part of her mind, even as the frightened human part of her screamed at her to simply run for help. His lips had taken on a faint bluish tint at the edges that had not been there minutes before. The tremor in his hands had progressed from the familiar shaking she had documented over 3 weeks into something more violent, nearly convulsive, and beneath his papery, translucent skin she could see, or thought she could see, a faint darkening along the pathways of his veins, a slow bruising spread that reminded her, with a lurch of recognition that turned her stomach cold, of exactly the kind of pattern she would expect from a slow-acting toxin working its way through a circulatory system. "Talk to me," she said, taking his cold, trembling hand in both of hers, keeping her voice steady and warm even as her mind raced through everything she knew about supporting a body in crisis. None of it, she realized, with a fresh wave of helplessness, designed for a body that was not entirely human to begin with. "Tell me about your wife. You mentioned her once, a few days ago. Tell me how you met her." It was, she would think later, one of the more instinctive decisions she made that night, reaching for memory rather than medicine, for the plain, aching human truth that a mind fighting to stay present needs an anchor more than it needs silence. And Augustus's clouded eyes found hers again, some of the wild panic in them softening slightly as he began, haltingly, to speak. "A garden party," he rasped, his words slurring but his grip on her hand tightening rather than continuing to weaken. 1951. She was wearing yellow. "I have never, in 300 years of existence, seen anything as bright as that dress in that garden." The door burst open before he could say more, Damien moving faster than Wren's eye could properly track, crossing the vast room in what felt like a single stride and dropping to his knees beside the bed, his cold hands already at his father's throat, his father's wrist, searching for the pulse that Wren suspected worked very differently in a body like this one. "What happened?" he said, and his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several more degrees, though his eyes, when they found Wren's, held none of that danger, only a raw and desperate fear that stripped away every last trace of his usual composure. "Silas came back while we were in the library," Wren said quickly, keeping her hands wrapped around Augustus's even as Damien took over the more urgent assessment. "He gave your father another dose of the tonic. His breathing's labored. There's a bluish tint at his lips. His hands have been shaking violently. And I think, Damien, I think I can see something under his skin, along the veins, some kind of dark discoloration that wasn't there this morning." Damien's head snapped up, his pale eyes flooding. In an instant, with a deep and terrible crimson that Ren had not yet seen from him in 3 weeks of careful, controlled interactions, and for one suspended moment she felt the full weight of exactly what he was settle over the room like a physical pressure, ancient and furious and entirely capable of violence, on a scale she did not think she had the capacity to fully imagine. "Father," Damien said, his voice gentling instantly, even as his eyes remained that terrible burning red. "Look at me. Stay with me. I am not losing you tonight, not to him, not after everything. Do you understand me? You will not leave me in this house alone." "Damien," Augustus managed, his voice fainter now, thinner, though his eyes had found some fresh clarity even as his body continued to fail around him. "Silas, the company he keeps now. Ask him about the buyer. Ask him who wanted this favor done. This was never only about the inheritance, boy. Someone else is behind this. Someone with older grudges than his." "What buyer?" Damien demanded, his hands tightening carefully around his father's shoulders. "Father, stay with me. What buyer? Who does he answer to?" But Augustus's eyes had begun to slide shut, his breathing shallowing further, the dark bruising along his veins, spreading visibly now beneath skin gone nearly translucent, and Ren felt the cold certainty settle into her chest that whatever window they had to act in was closing faster than either of them had accounted for. "He needs blood," Ren said suddenly, the realization arriving with the force of something obvious that she should have understood from the very first night, from every half-formed detail she had catalogued and refused to let herself fully interpret. "If he's what you are, if the tonic is poisoning him the way I think it is, then food isn't going to fix this. It never was. That's why nothing I made him ever fully worked. Why he'd improve in the mornings and decline all afternoon. Because I was only ever treating half the problem. He needs blood, Damien. Real blood. Strong enough to fight whatever's in his system." Damien's crimson eyes found hers, and in them, for just a moment, she saw something that looked almost like awe layered over the terror. The same expression she had glimpsed in the library an hour earlier when she had laid out 3 weeks of careful documentation that an entire staff of physicians had failed to assemble. "He is too weak to take from a stranger safely right now," Damien said, his voice tight with a decision Ren could see him making in real time, weighing something against something else with visible, agonized speed. "It has to be blood he trusts completely, given freely, without fear tainting it. Blood laced with fear will do him more harm than good in this state." "Then take mine," Ren said, before she had fully finished thinking the sentence through, already pushing back the sleeve of her cardigan, some fierce and entirely unfamiliar certainty rising up in her that had nothing to do with 3 weeks of careful professional distance, and everything to do with the terrified, desperate hope she had watched flicker and dim in Augustus Ashworth's clouded eyes just moments before. "I'm not afraid. You both know I'm not afraid. Take it, Damien. Save him." Damien went very still, his crimson eyes fixed on her bared wrist, on the pulse visibly beating there, and for one long, suspended heartbeat, Ren watched something war behind his eyes, some ancient and starving instinct pulling hard against the careful control he had clearly spent centuries building. And she did not look away, did not flinch, only held his gaze steadily and waited. "Are you certain?" he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way she had not heard from him before, stripped of every trace of its usual cold formality. "I have never been more certain of anything," Wren said. "Now, hurry. We're running out of time." Damien moved with a speed that Wren's eyes could not fully follow. One moment kneeling beside his father's bed, and the next kneeling beside her instead. His cold fingers wrapped with impossible gentleness around her offered wrist, his crimson eyes searching her face one final time for any flicker of hesitation, any last-second fear he could use as an excuse to refuse her. He found none. Wren held his gaze steadily, her pulse hammering not with terror, but with something closer to resolve, and gave him the smallest nod. His fangs, when they descended, were finer and sharper than anything her imagination had conjured in 3 weeks of half-formed suspicion, and the bite itself, when it came, was nothing like the violent tearing she might have expected. It was precise, almost tender, a single sharp point of pressure that bloomed into something warm rather than painful. A strange, heavy heat spreading up her arm and into her chest as Damien drank, careful and controlled, taking only what he needed and not a drop more. She felt the room tilt gently around her, her vision softening at the edges, and distantly she heard Damien's voice, rough with restraint, murmuring something against her skin that might have been her name or might have been a promise. She could not tell which. And then he pulled back, pressing his own torn wrist to Augustus's pale lips instead, his blood now carrying the borrowed strength of hers into his father's failing body. "Drink, father," Damien commanded, his voice raw. "Drink and fight. I am not losing you tonight." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Augustus's lips barely parting, his breathing so shallow Wren could no longer see his chest rise at all, and she felt a cold horror settle over her that they had moved too slowly, that her offer had come a handful of minutes too late to matter. Then, achingly slow, Augustus's throat moved. He swallowed, and swallowed again, his trembling hand rising to grip his son's wrist and hold it in place, drinking with a desperate, growing strength that built with every passing second. The dark bruising beneath his skin began, impossibly, to recede, the discoloration along his veins fading back toward something closer to healthy pallor, his labored breathing gradually deepening and evening out, the bluish tint at his lips warming back toward a more natural color. Wren watched it happen with the particular awed disbelief of someone witnessing a medical impossibility unfold in real time. Her own head still spinning pleasantly from the blood loss, her body leaning without her fully deciding to against the solid, cold strength of Damien's shoulder. After what felt like both several minutes and no time at all, Augustus released his son's wrist, sinking back against his pillows, with a long, shuddering exhale that carried none of the labored strain it had minutes before, his clouded eyes opening to find something sharper and clearer in them than Wren had seen in 3 weeks of caring for him. "Well?" Augustus said, his voice, though weak, carrying a thread of dry humor that made Wren's throat tighten with sudden relief. "That was considerably more excitement than I've had in decades. Remind me to thank you both properly once I'm not quite so busy not dying." "You scared me," Damien said, and the raw, unguarded emotion in his voice made it clear that formality had entirely abandoned him for the moment, that whatever centuries-old composure he usually wore had been stripped away by the last quarter hour. "I thought I was going to lose you tonight." "Not tonight," Augustus murmured, his eyes drifting past his son toward Wren, softening as they found her. Not with a guardian angel like this one keeping watch. Ren, are you all right? He took rather a lot, I imagine. And you're only human. I'm fine, Ren said, though the room was still swimming slightly, and she suspected, from the careful way Damien's arm had come around her without her quite noticing that she looked considerably less fine than she was claiming. Just need a minute. And maybe something with iron in it, ironically. Once I can stand up straight again. Damien's arm tightened around her, and when she glanced up at him, she found his crimson eyes had softened back toward their more familiar pale gray, though something new lived in them now, something that had not been there before tonight. Raw and unguarded, and entirely undisguised. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that went far beyond simple gratitude. "I do not have adequate words for what you did tonight, Ren. Not simply the blood, the certainty. You did not hesitate. You needed help," Ren said simply, though her own pulse had picked up again under the intensity of his gaze, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with blood loss. "I had it to give." "That's not complicated, Damien. It is considerably more complicated than you're making it sound," Damien said. But there was warmth in it now rather than argument, and he did not release her, kept her steady against his side, while Mrs. Colley, summoned by some signal Ren had not seen given, arrived with a tray of dark, rich food for Augustus and a glass of orange juice pressed insistently into Ren's own hands. The older woman's usual severe composure cracked open just slightly by evident relief. It was some time later, once Augustus had eaten properly for the first time in months and drifted into a deep, natural sleep that bore no resemblance to the fitful unconsciousness of the past weeks, that Damien finally walked Ren back to her suite, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back the entire way, a point of contact neither of them commented on, and neither of them broke. "We need to talk about what my father said," Damien told her once they reached her door, his voice returning slowly to something closer to its usual measured control, though the warmth from earlier had not fully receded. "About the buyer. He was implying Silas is not acting alone, that someone else, someone with older grievances against this family, is behind whatever he's been doing. Do you have any idea who that could be?" Ren asked, leaning against her doorframe, exhaustion finally beginning to properly settle over her now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Several possibilities," Damien said grimly. "My family has accumulated enemies across 3 centuries of holding significant power in this region. It could be any number of old grudges resurfacing, but I intend to find out precisely who and precisely why before my cousin gets the chance to finish what he started tonight. Let me help," Ren said immediately. And when Damien's expression shifted into something like protective refusal, she pressed on before he could voice it. "I found the pattern nobody else caught in 3 weeks. I'm the one Silas has been testing information on, whether he realizes I've noticed or not. I want to help you finish this, Damien. Not just for your father's sake, for yours." Damien studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his pale eyes. And then, slowly, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his cold fingers lingering against her cheek in a way that made her breath catch. "You are the most stubborn human being I have encountered in 300 years, he said softly, and there was no complaint in it at all. Only something that sounded, unmistakably, like tenderness. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin properly. Together, since you have apparently decided that is non-negotiable. It is, Wren said, smiling despite her exhaustion. And something in the answering smile that crossed Damien's usually guarded face stayed with her long after he had finally, reluctantly, said good night and retreated down the dark corridor, leaving her alone with her spinning head and her hammering heart, and the growing, undeniable understanding that whatever was happening between them now was no longer simply professional. She woke the following morning in her own bed, though she had no clear memory of how she had gotten there. The pale grey light of dawn filtering through her curtains, and the dull, distant ache in her wrist, the only lingering evidence that the previous night had not simply been some strange, vivid dream. A note sat folded on her nightstand, written in a precise, old-fashioned hand that could only have belonged to Damien, informing her that Mrs. Colley had carried her up once exhaustion, had finally claimed her mid-sentence in the library, that Augustus was resting comfortably and improving by the hour, and that she was to eat something substantial the moment she woke, and not so much as think about entering the kitchen to cook for anyone else until she had done so herself. She found, reading it, that she was smiling before she had fully processed why. Breakfast. When Mrs. Colley brought it up herself, rather than sending it with the usual staff, arrived with a warmth in the older woman's expression that Wren had not seen in 3 weeks of careful, guarded interactions. You gave that family something back last night that I confess I had stopped believing they would ever have again, Mrs. Colley said, setting the tray down with unusual gentleness. I have served this household for the better part of 40 years, Miss Callahan. I watched Mr. Ashworth raise his son largely alone after his wife passed. Watched him build an empire out of grief and duty, because he did not know what else to do with either. I have never, in all that time, seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you last night while you slept. Wren did not entirely know how to respond to that, and settled instead for a quiet thank you that felt inadequate to the weight of what the older woman had just offered her. A small window into 40 years of careful, guarded loyalty finally cracking open. She spent the following days in a state that felt almost dreamlike. The house's usual chilled formality, softened at the edges now by something warmer. Augustus, growing stronger by the hour and more talkative with every meal, insisting on stories from his long life that stretched back further than Wren's mind could comfortably hold, tales of wars fought, and empires that had risen and crumbled in the time it had taken most human families to pass down 3 or 4 generations. He spoke of Damien's mother, Eleanor, with a tenderness that made Wren's chest ache each time. A portrait of a woman who had apparently possessed exactly the kind of fierce, stubborn warmth that Augustus seemed increasingly convinced Wren herself carried in equal measure. She would have liked you very much, Augustus told her one afternoon, watching her plate a delicate tart. She had prepared more for the simple pleasure of his company than any strict dietary need at this point in his recovery. Elena never had patience for people who deferred to Damien simply because of what he was. She used to say, "The only opinions worth having were the ones you were willing to defend to a vampire king's face. I imagine you would have gotten along famously." "I hope I would have," Wren said softly, and meant it. Damien, for his part, found reasons to be near the kitchen and near Augustus's rooms, with a frequency that made even the more discreet members of the household staff begin to exchange small, knowing glances whenever he appeared. He no longer bothered pretending the visits were purely about his father's recovery, though he was careful, in those early days, not to presume too much, always leaving the choice of closeness to Wren, always watching her with a careful attentiveness that made clear he was waiting, patiently, for whatever she was ready to give. It was on the fourth evening after the crisis, the two of them sitting together on the wide stone terrace overlooking the dark, fog-wrapped grounds, while Augustus slept soundly for the first time in months, that Damien finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting behind his careful composure since that first bite in the library. "Does it frighten you?" he asked quietly, watching the mist curl low over the hedges below. "What you saw that night. What I am." Fully, without the polite distance of formal introductions and careful explanations. "I gave you every opportunity to run in that kitchen, and you did not take it, and I confess I have spent every day since trying to understand why." Wren considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she turned over every important thing, unwilling to offer him a comforting answer that was not also an honest one. "I've spent 14 years watching people at the very end of everything," she said finally. "Watching what's left once all the pretense falls away. Once someone's too sick or too tired or too close to dying to keep performing whatever version of themselves the world expects. I learned a long time ago that what someone is capable of doesn't frighten me nearly as much as what they choose to do with it. You could have let your father die slowly and quietly and inherited everything without lifting a finger. You didn't. You tore your own kitchen apart, trying to save me from your cousin without a single moment's hesitation. That's not something that frightens me, Damien. That's something I trust." Damien was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made the cool night air between them feel suddenly very warm. And then, slowly, he reached across the small distance separating them and took her hand in his, cold fingers wrapping gently around hers. 300 years, he said softly, "and I do not believe I have ever once been trusted so completely by someone with so little reason to offer it freely. I do not intend to waste what you've given me, Wren. I want you to know that clearly. Before whatever comes next between us, I'm not going anywhere," Wren said, and found, saying it, that it was truer than almost anything she had said in a very long time. The following days settled into a new and charged rhythm. Augustus improved steadily, his strength returning with a speed that visibly startled even Mrs. Colley, his appetite for both food and conversation growing robust enough that he began, much to Wren's quiet amusement, to complain about the blandness of his broth again, a complaint she took as the surest possible sign of genuine recovery. Silas did not return to the estate, whether out of caution or design Wren could not say, but his absence sat over the house like held breath, a storm everyone could feel gathering without yet being able to see. That same week, sitting alone in her suite during one of the rare quiet afternoons Augustus had insisted on spending resting rather than holding court from his bed, Wren finally worked up the nerve to call her sister, something she had put off for longer than she cared to admit, out of a tangled mix of guilt and fear that talking about the strange new life she had fallen into would somehow make it feel less real, or worse, would make her have to explain it out loud. Ivy answered on the second ring, her voice thin but steady in the particular way it always sounded after a dialysis session, worn down but stubbornly cheerful regardless. "Wren? Hey, I was starting to think That fancy new job of yours had swallowed you whole. What is it? Some kind of witness protection situation? You've been weirdly vague on every call. It's complicated, Wren admitted, curling up in the deep window seat, overlooking the misted gardens below, and found herself smiling despite the exhaustion of the past week. But good complicated, I think. Mostly good. How are you feeling? How was the last treatment? Better. Actually, Ivy said, and there was a note of genuine surprise in it that made something in Wren's chest tighten. The new insurance kicked in a few days ago. Some group plan you apparently got me added to, and they scheduled me into this incredible nephrology practice downtown, the kind of place I always assumed only rich people got into. The doctor there thinks there might actually be a transplant pathway now. Wren, a real one, not just theoretical. I haven't let myself hope about that in years. Wren had to press the back of her hand briefly against her mouth. Unexpected tears stinging sharp and sudden. Some knot of guilt and worry she had been carrying silently for 3 years. Finally beginning, however slightly, to loosen. That's, she managed, her voice rough. That's the best thing I've heard in a long time, Ivy. I'm so glad. You sound different, Ivy said, with the particular perceptiveness only a younger sister who has spent a lifetime being cared for by an older one can manage. Good different. Tell me about this job. Really tell me. Not the careful version you've been giving me on the phone. Wren hesitated, glancing instinctively toward her closed bedroom door, as though the walls themselves might somehow carry word of the conversation back to the family she now lived among. And then, slowly, began to explain, choosing her words with the particular care of someone navigating a legal confidentiality agreement, while also, for the first time in 14 months, wanting desperately to be fully honest with the one person in the world who had never once doubted her. I'm caring for an elderly man, she said carefully. His son runs the household. It's Ivy. It's the strangest, most intense few weeks of my life. And I think I might actually be falling for the son, which is completely insane given how long I've known him. And also, there was a genuinely terrifying situation a few nights ago that I really can't fully explain over the phone. But everyone's safe now, I promise. And the old man I'm caring for is doing so much better because of, honestly, because of me. Ivy. I did that. For the first time since Mr. Whitfield, I actually feel like myself again. There was a pause on the line. And then Ivy said, with the dry, teasing warmth that had gotten both of them through more hard years than either liked to count, "So, let me get this straight. You took a mysterious job with a cryptic hiring agency, moved into what sounds like a literal Gothic mansion, are apparently dating your employer's son, and something terrifying happened that you can't talk about, but everyone survived. Wren, this sounds like the plot of every dark romance novel I've ever seen you pretend you don't read on your lunch breaks." Wren laughed, startled and genuine, the sound easing something tight in her chest that had been held there for a very long time. "Yeah," she admitted. "Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't it?" "Well, whatever it is," Ivy said, her voice softening, "I haven't heard you sound this alive in over a year. Whoever this family is, Wren, thank you for whatever they're doing to give you that back. Just be careful and tell me more when you actually can." I want the full story. Eventually, cryptic, Gothic mansion and all. I promise, Wren said, and meant it, and hung up feeling lighter than she had in longer than she could properly measure. The guilt she had been quietly carrying about leaving her sister behind in the city finally settling into something closer to peace. Damien threw himself into investigation with the same controlled, focused intensity Wren had come to recognize in him. Drawing on contacts and resources, she did not fully understand the scope of old debts owed by old families, information bought and traded through channels that existed far outside anything resembling ordinary business. He shared what he learned with her each evening, the two of them working through it together in the library long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. And Wren found herself, despite everything strange and dangerous about the situation, looking forward to those hours more than she had looked forward to anything in longer than she cared to admit. It was on the 7th evening after the crisis that Damien finally laid out what he had uncovered, spreading a handful of documents and photographs across the desk between them with the grim satisfaction of a man who had finally assembled a puzzle he had been fighting for months. "His name is Reginald Voss," Damien said, tapping a photograph of an older, silver-haired man with sharp, calculating features. "No relation to my driver. Before you ask, merely a coincidence of surname in a world smaller than you'd expect. He is the last surviving head of a coven my father crushed nearly a century ago, during a territorial dispute that cost Voss's family everything: their standing, their holdings, their claim to this entire region. He has been waiting a very long time for an opportunity to settle that debt. And my cousin, it seems, was more than willing to provide him with one, in exchange for a considerable payment and a promise of support once Silas assumed control of this family. So Silas isn't just trying to inherit early," Wren said slowly, working through the implications. "He's selling out his own family's future to an outside enemy, just to get what he wants faster." "Precisely," Damien said, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. "Voss wants my father dead as revenge. Plain and simple, a century-old grudge finally settled. Silas wants control of everything my father built, and does not particularly care what he has to sacrifice to get it." Together they concocted the tonic, a slow-acting toxin drawn from an old and largely forgotten formula, one designed specifically to poison creatures of our kind, gradually enough that it would be mistaken for natural decline, rather than deliberate murder. It very nearly worked. "It would have worked," Wren said quietly, "if you hadn't hired someone paranoid enough to keep a notebook." "If I hadn't hired you," Damien corrected, and something in the way he said it, low and deliberate, made the air between them feel suddenly very charged. "My father would very likely be dead right now, and I would have spent whatever remained of my existence never understanding why. I do not know how to properly repay a debt of that magnitude, Wren." "You don't have to repay it," Wren said, her voice softer now, the charged silence between them stretching into something that felt, for the first time, entirely unguarded on both sides. "I didn't do it for payment." "Then why?" Damien asked, and the question hung in the air with a weight that went far beyond simple curiosity, his pale eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Because he mattered to me," Wren said honestly. "And because you did too, faster than I expected you to, and faster than I think either of us planned on." Damien was quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to step back if she wanted to. He closed the distance between them and pressed his cold lips to hers, careful and searching. A question rather than a claim. Wren answered it without hesitation, her hands finding the lapels of his jacket and pulling him closer. And when he finally drew back, both of them slightly breathless, his expression had lost every trace of the careful, guarded formality she had met 3 weeks ago entirely. I have lived 3 centuries, convinced I would never again feel anything close to what I am feeling right now, Damien murmured against her forehead, his arms wrapped around her with a gentle, careful strength that made her feel, for the first time in over a year, entirely safe. I did not expect it to arrive wearing an apron and carrying a notebook full of observations no one else thought to make. I contain multitudes, Wren said, laughing softly despite the weight of everything happening around them, and felt Damien's answering laugh, low and rare and genuine, vibrate against her. The peace did not last. It rarely does, in houses like this one, and Wren would learn, over the following week, exactly how quickly gathered storms finally break. It happened on a night when Damien had traveled into the city to meet with contacts regarding Voss's remaining holdings, determined to cut off whatever resources the old vampire still commanded before moving against him directly, leaving Wren alone at the estate with only Mrs. Colley, a handful of household staff, and Augustus, whose strength had returned enough in the preceding days that he had begun taking short walks through the grounds each evening, insisting, over Wren's gentle protests, that he was more than capable of managing a stroll around his own gardens. She was in the kitchen preparing a late meal. The house settled into its familiar deep hush when the lights flickered once, twice, and then died entirely, plunging the room into sudden, absolute darkness. "Mrs. Colley," Wren called, setting down the knife she had been holding, some old instinct sharpening immediately into alertness. "Is everyone all right?" There was no answer. Only silence, heavier and more complete than the usual quiet of the house, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of glass breaking somewhere in the east wing. Wren moved through the dark kitchen with careful, practiced steps, years of navigating unfamiliar homes at odd hours guiding her hands along familiar countertops toward the drawer, where she knew a heavy flashlight was kept, and had just closed her fingers around it when a voice spoke from the doorway behind her, pleasant and warm in a way that made her blood run instantly cold. "Working late, Miss Callahan," Silas said, and even in the darkness she could hear the smile in his voice. "I do apologize for the inconvenience with the power. Necessary, I'm afraid, for what comes next." Wren spun to face him, flashlight raised though she had not yet turned it on, her heart hammering. "Where's Mrs. Colley? Where's Augustus?" "Being dealt with," Silas repeated, sensing the fear beneath her controlled voice and clearly savoring it, moving further into the kitchen with an unhurried, predatory patience that made her skin crawl. "You know, I want you to understand something before this ends, Miss Callahan, because I do think you deserve at least that much honesty, given how thoroughly you've managed to ruin what should have been a very simple, very quiet inheritance. I did not want to kill my own uncle. Truly, I have watched that man for decades, watched him build something extraordinary out of nothing, watched my own father waste away in his shadow, never quite trusted with the responsibilities he believed himself owed. Do you have any idea what it is like to watch someone else's son handed everything simply because of the order in which 2 brothers happened to be born? Augustus always favored Damien's line. Always. My father died believing he would never be more than a footnote in this family's history. And Augustus never once offered him so much as a fraction of the trust he handed his golden nephew without a second thought. So this was never about the family at all, Wren said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest with every step Silas took toward her. Some old instinct telling her that keeping him talking, keeping him engaged, might buy her the seconds she desperately needed. This was about you finally proving something to a dead man. Silas's expression flickered, something raw and wounded crossing it before the cold. Calculating pleasantness slid back into place. "Careful," he said softly. "You're rather more perceptive than a cook has any business being. It's precisely why you've become such a problem. I offered Voss a simple arrangement. He wanted his century-old grudge settled. I wanted what was rightfully mine. Finally, after decades of being overlooked, the tonic was elegant, don't you think? Slow enough to look natural, quiet enough that no one would ever think to question it. And then you arrived, with your notebook and your stubborn refusal to stop watching, and undid months of very careful patience in the span of a few weeks. You could still walk away," Wren said, though she doubted, even as she said it, that there was any version of this conversation that ended with Silas simply leaving. "Damien will find out everything eventually, with or without me. Killing me doesn't undo what's already been uncovered." "No," Silas agreed, and something in his pale eyes had gone flat and final now. The pretense of civility finally, fully abandoning him. "But it does mean I get the considerable satisfaction of taking something from him the way he's spent his entire existence taking things, without effort, without consequence, simply because the world has always arranged itself conveniently in his favor. You've become rather important to him, you know. To both of them. Breaking that seems at this point like a fitting enough consolation prize." "You're wrong," Wren said, forcing conviction into her voice, even as she continued easing backward, her heel finally bumping against the counter that housed the knife block. "He won't break. Not over me. He's stronger than you'll ever understand. And so is Augustus. And so, for the record, am I." "We'll see," Silas said softly. "You're not getting anywhere near either of them again," Wren said, her fingers closing at last around the smooth wooden handle of the largest knife in the block. "Oh, I don't need to get anywhere near him at all," Silas said, and there was something genuinely delighted in his tone now, the pleasure of a man finally allowed to stop pretending. "You've done that work for me already. In a sense, you're the one he trusts completely now. You're the one whose blood saved him, whose company he craves, whose absence, I imagine, would break something in him rather more thoroughly than any tonic ever could. Damien, too, for that matter. I've watched him with you, Miss Callahan. 3 centuries of careful isolation, and a cook with a stubborn spine undid it all in a matter of weeks. Removing you seems at this point considerably more efficient than continuing to poison a man who apparently has you standing guard over every meal." Wren's hand closed around the handle of a knife, her mind racing through every option available to her. The flashlight forgotten, the distance to the door, the layout of a kitchen she knew better than almost anyone alive at this point. "You're not going to touch me," she said, with far more confidence than she actually felt. Silas laughed, low and cold, and moved toward her with a speed that made the knife in her hand feel suddenly, desperately inadequate. She would think afterward that the only reason she survived those next several minutes at all was the decade of careful discipline that had trained her body to move with purpose even under pressure, ducking beneath Silas's first grasping reach and putting the heavy central island between them, throwing the flashlight, still unlit, hard enough to catch him across the temple and buy herself 2 precious seconds to scramble toward the door. She did not make it far. His hand closed around her arm before she reached the threshold, wrenching her back with a force that tore a cry from her throat. And she twisted, driving the knife she still held down toward whatever part of him she could reach. Felt it connect with something solid before his other hand closed around her throat and lifted her entirely off the floor. "Feisty," Silas hissed, his fangs fully extended now, his pale eyes gone entirely black in the darkness. "I can see the appeal, truthfully. A pity I don't have time to properly enjoy it before I finish this." The kitchen door exploded off its hinges. Wren would never, for the rest of whatever long, strange life awaited her after this night, forget the sight of Damien Ashworth crossing that ruined doorway, his eyes burning a red so deep and violent it seemed to cast its own light across the dark room, his entire bearing radiating a fury that made even Silas, still holding Wren aloft by the throat, visibly falter. "Put her down," Damien said, and his voice was not loud, was barely above a whisper, and yet it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house around them. "Cousin," Silas managed, though his composure had cracked entirely now, his grip on Wren loosening just slightly as raw fear finally broke through his earlier confidence. "I can explain." "You cannot," Damien said, and moved. Wren hit the ground hard as Silas released her, gasping for air, scrambling backward against the counter as the 2 vampires became a blur of impossible violence above her, the kitchen dissolving into chaos, cabinets splintering, glass shattering, the heavy central island cracking clean in half beneath some impact she could not fully track with her human eyes. She heard Silas scream something about Voss, about a deal, about mercy, and heard Damien's response, low and merciless, that mercy had died the moment Silas laid a hand on what belonged to him. It ended quickly, in the way these things apparently did, a final, wet, terrible sound, followed by absolute silence, and Wren, still catching her breath against the ruined counter, watched as Damien turned from what remained of his cousin and crossed the wrecked kitchen toward her in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside her, his crimson eyes searching her face and throat with a desperate, careful urgency. "Are you hurt?" he said, his cold hands hovering over the darkening bruises already forming at her throat, not quite touching, as though afraid of causing further harm. "Wren, tell me you're all right." "I'm okay," she managed, her voice rough but steady. "Augustus, Mrs. Colley." Silas said his people were dealing with them. Damien's expression hardened instantly, and he was on his feet again in a heartbeat, though this time he pulled Wren up with him, refusing, she understood without needing him to say it, to leave her alone again in this house tonight. They found Mrs. Colley in the east corridor, shaken but unharmed, having apparently fought off her own attacker with a fireplace poker and considerably more ferocity than her prim exterior had ever suggested, and found Augustus in his room, standing rather than lying down for the first time in months, having dealt with a swift and brutal efficiency that made clear exactly how formidable he must once have been, with the two men Voss had sent to finish him. "I am rather more capable than everyone in this house seems to keep assuming," Augustus said dryly, though his eyes softened considerably when they landed on Wren, taking in the bruising at her throat with visible concern. "Are you all right, my dear?" "I will be," Wren said, and found, looking around at this strange gathered family, bruised and battered, but alive, standing together in the wreckage of a night that had nearly destroyed everything, that she meant it with a certainty she had not felt about anything in a very long time. The remaining threads unraveled quickly after that, though not without one final, desperate reckoning. Voss, deprived of his inside man, and his careful patience finally exposed, did not simply retreat quietly back into the shadows he had spent a century nursing his grievance in. Word reached the estate 3 days after Silas's death, carried by one of Damien's contacts in the city, that Voss had begun gathering what remained of his old, scattered allies, calling in decades of favors and debts, in a final, furious attempt to salvage something from a plan a century in the making that had unraveled in a matter of weeks. "He is not a fool," Damien said grimly, pacing the length of the library, while Wren sat curled in one of the deep leather chairs, watching him with the particular worry that had become a near-constant companion since that terrible night in the kitchen. "He knows he cannot simply walk away from this. My father is recovering. Silas is dead. His entire century of patience has been spent for nothing, and men like Voss do not absorb that kind of loss quietly. He will come for us directly, and soon, before we have the chance to move against whatever remains of his resources. First, then we don't wait for him to choose the moment," Augustus said from the doorway, his voice carrying a strength and clarity that would have seemed impossible only 2 weeks earlier, and Wren turned to find him standing tall and steady, dressed not in the soft robes he had worn through his long illness, but in a dark, severe suit that made him look, for the first time since she had met him, every inch the formidable king his son so often described. "I built this family standing in this region 3 centuries ago, Damien. I did not do it by waiting patiently in my own house for enemies to arrive on their own schedule. Father, you're barely 2 weeks recovered," Damien began, though Wren could see, even as he said it, that he already knew the argument was lost. "I am considerably more recovered than I have any right to be, thanks entirely to the woman sitting in that chair," Augustus said, his pale eyes warm as they settled on Wren before returning, sharper, to his son. "And I will not spend whatever remains of my existence hiding behind these walls, while a man who has hated this family for 100 years decides when and how to finally end things. We end this on our terms, Damien. Together, as it should have been from the start." Wren rose from the chair, some fierce and unfamiliar resolve rising up in her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with 3 weeks of watching this family fight, in their own strange, ancient way, for exactly the kind of loyalty and love she had spent 14 months believing she had lost the capacity to be part of. "I'm coming too," she said, before either man could suggest otherwise. "Absolutely not," Damien said immediately, turning to face her with an expression that mixed protective fear and something that looked underneath it, almost like exasperated affection. "Wren, This is not a negotiation. Voss has already shown he's willing to use you as a weapon against me. I will not hand him a second opportunity. You won't be handing him anything, Ren said evenly. I'll be standing behind whatever line of defense you set up, staying out of the way, exactly like a sensible person. But I am not sitting in this house waiting to find out whether the two of you survive a fight I could have helped prepare for. I found the pattern that saved Augustus's life. Let me help finish this the same way. Information, logistics, whatever, doesn't require me standing in the direct path of anything with fangs. Damien studied her for a long moment, something warring behind his pale eyes. And then, slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like resignation, and beneath that, unmistakably, pride. You are entirely too stubborn for your own good, he said quietly. You've mentioned that before, Ren said, and found herself smiling despite the danger gathering around them. And now show me what you know about how Voss operates, so I can actually be useful instead of just underfoot. They spent the following 2 days in careful, focused preparation. Damien's contacts confirming that Voss had assembled a force of perhaps a dozen loyal allies, old grudges and older debts calling them to his side for one final stand. And on the third night, exactly as Damien's sources had predicted, Voss arrived at the estate's iron gates beneath a cold, clear winter moon, his small gathered force spread out behind him, like something out of an old, half-forgotten war. Ren watched from the great windows above the courtyard, exactly as she had promised. Mrs. Colley standing steady and grim beside her with a poker gripped in one hand that made clear the older woman had no intention of remaining purely a spectator if things went badly, while below, Damien and Augustus stood together in the courtyard, father and son, united against a century-old enemy in a way that made something ache fiercely in Ren's chest, equal parts fear and awe. Ashworth, Voss called across the frost-covered gravel, his voice carrying an old, formal cadence that spoke of centuries long past. This ends tonight, one way or another. You took everything from my line 100 years ago. I intend to take everything from yours in return. You already tried, Augustus said, his voice steady and cold, carrying easily across the courtyard despite his weakened state only weeks before. You poisoned me slowly, through my own blood, using my own nephew's greed as your instrument, and it still was not enough. I am standing here, Voss. Whatever debt you believe you're owed, you will not collect it tonight. We shall see about that, Voss said. And the courtyard erupted into violence. Ren pressed her hand flat against the cold glass, watching with her heart hammering as the fight unfolded below in a blur of impossible speed. Damien and Augustus, moving together with a fluid, practiced coordination that spoke of centuries fighting side by side, father and son covering each other's openings with an instinctive precision that Voss's hastily assembled allies could not match. It was, she would think later, both the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. Violence rendered almost balletic in its precision. The two men she loved most in this strange new life, fighting not out of rage, but out of something steadier and more powerful. A determination to protect what remained of their family. And, she understood now, watching Damien's eyes find her window, even in the chaos of battle. to protect her as well. It was over within perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt considerably longer standing helpless at that window, Voss's scattered allies falling one by one, until only Voss himself remained, backed against the estate's iron gates, his century of careful, patient hatred, finally, entirely spent. "You have already lost everything you came here for," Damien said, standing over him, his voice quiet now, the fury of the fight settling into something colder and more final. "Silas is dead. My father lives. Whatever grievance you carried is finished, Voss. And it ends here, tonight, one way or another." "Then let it end," Voss said, something almost like relief in his ruined voice. A man who had carried a century of hatred so long it had become its own kind of prison, finally allowed to set it down. It ended the way old grievances so often do, in blood and ash beneath a silent moon. And when Damien finally turned from the courtyard and made his way back into the house, his suit torn but his eyes clear, Wren met him at the door and did not hesitate before stepping into his arms. "It's finished," he murmured against her hair. "Truly finished." This time, the weeks that followed settled into something Wren had not expected to find in this cold, Gothic house when she had first arrived, desperate and broke and certain she was walking into either a scam or a nightmare. Augustus recovered fully, his strength and his sharp, dry humor restored entirely, and he took to treating Wren less like household staff and considerably more like the daughter he had apparently always wished he'd had, insisting she join him for meals rather than simply preparing them, teaching her, in long, rambling afternoon conversations, pieces of a family history spanning 3 centuries that few living beings had ever been trusted with. The household itself seemed to exhale. In those weeks, the way a house does after a long fever finally breaks. Mrs. Colley's severe composure softened by careful degrees, her clipped formality giving way, on quiet mornings, to something almost like warmth, and she took to sharing small pieces of her own long history with the family over tea. Stories of decades spent watching Damien grow from a solemn, guarded boy into the controlled, careful man Wren had first met in that cold study. Stories that helped Wren understand, layer by layer, exactly how much loneliness he had carried long before Silas's betrayal had ever made itself known. The other staff, too, seemed to relax around her in ways they had not during those first uncertain weeks, no longer treating her with the wary distance reserved for someone who might not last the month, but with the easy familiarity of someone who had unmistakably become a permanent fixture of the house. Dr. Renner, summoned back to the estate for a final consultation once Augustus's recovery was fully confirmed, examined the old man with visible, professional bewilderment, running the same tests he had run monthly for the better part of a year, and finding, this time, nothing but robust and entirely inexplicable health. "I don't know what changed," the nervous physician admitted, packing away his equipment with hands that trembled slightly under the weight of Damien's pointed, unreadable stare. "Whatever was happening before, it's simply gone. I've never seen a recovery like this in my career." "You wouldn't have," Damien said evenly, and did not elaborate further, though Wren caught the corner of his mouth twitching with something that might have been dark amusement once the flustered doctor had finally taken his leave. Ivy's medical debts were settled in full within a month. Her treatment moved to facilities that made her prognosis, for the first time in years, genuinely hopeful, and Wren made the trip into the city herself, one crisp autumn afternoon, to see her sister in person for the first time since accepting the strange, life-altering position that had brought her to the Ashworth estate. Ivy met her at the door of her small apartment with tears already gathering, pulling Wren into a fierce hug before she had even fully stepped inside. "You look incredible," Ivy said, pulling back to study her sister's face with open wonder. "I mean it, Wren. You look like yourself again. The version of you I haven't seen since before, everything with Mr. Whitfield. Whatever's happening in that mansion, it's working." "It's working," Wren agreed, and found herself, over the following hours, finally telling her sister as much of the truth as she was able, watching Ivy's expression cycle through disbelief and alarm and, eventually, a kind of delighted, incredulous acceptance that only a sister who had weathered a lifetime of hardship alongside her could offer. "A vampire," Ivy repeated for perhaps the third time, sitting back against her worn couch cushions with an expression somewhere between horror and fascination. "An actual, honest-to-God vampire king, and you're just, what, dating him now? Casually?" "There's nothing casual about it," Wren admitted, feeling a warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the tea Ivy had made them. "It's the most serious thing that's ever happened to me, Ivy. He asked me to stay, not just as Augustus's caretaker, as his, properly his, and I said yes before he'd even finished asking." Ivy studied her for a long moment, her earlier teasing softening into something more solemn, and reached out to take her sister's hand. "You deserve this," she said quietly. "After everything that happened with Mr. Whitfield, after carrying my debt on your shoulders for years without ever once complaining about it, you deserve to have someone look at you the way you're describing him looking at you. I'm happy for you, Wren. Genuinely. Even if the whole vampire thing is going to take me a hot minute to fully process." Wren laughed, pulling her sister into another hug, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that every piece of her scattered, difficult life had finally settled into something that made sense. She returned to the estate 2 days later to find it transformed by the golden, fading light of early autumn. The grounds she had first seen, shrouded in fog now glowing amber and russet beneath a low afternoon sun, and found Damien waiting for her at the gates himself, rather than sending the usual car, standing beside the tall iron entrance with a stillness that had once unsettled her and now, she realized, simply felt like coming home. "You didn't have to come meet me," she said, crossing the gravel drive toward him. "I wanted to," Damien said simply. And there was something in his voice, some careful weight he was clearly building toward, that made her slow her steps as she reached him. "I've spent this entire visit thinking, Wren, about what you've given this family, about what I very nearly lost before I understood how much I stood to lose. My father tells me I have been considerably more insufferable than usual these past 2 days, pacing the library at all hours." "Apparently, that sounds about right," Wren said, smiling despite the sudden nervous flutter building in her chest at the seriousness settling over his features. "Come inside," Damien said. "My father is waiting. There's something I'd like to ask you, and I find I would rather he be present when I do." She followed him through the grand foyer and down the familiar corridor toward the library, her heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and found Augustus already waiting there when they arrived, seated in his favorite chair by the fire, with an expression of barely contained delight that made Wren's suspicion of what was coming solidify into something closer to certainty. "Finally," Augustus said, rising to greet her with a warmth that had become, over these strange months, as familiar and steady as anything in her life. I have been waiting 3 days for my son to work up the nerve to do this properly, Wren. I was beginning to think I would need to intervene myself. Father, Damien said, a note of genuine embarrassment coloring his usually composed voice. And Wren found herself laughing despite the building weight of the moment, some of the nervous tension easing at the sight of this powerful, ancient man looking, for once, entirely unsure of himself. Damien turned to face her fully then, taking both her hands in his pale eyes, holding hers with an intensity that stripped away every trace of his usual careful reserve. And Wren felt the whole of the past several months settle into this single suspended moment. The desperate email from an agency that should not have existed. The cold, Gothic house that had felt, on that first afternoon, like walking into the mouth of something ancient and patient. The slow unraveling of a mystery that had nearly cost them everything. The blood she had offered without hesitation. The fight in a ruined kitchen that had shown her exactly what this family was capable of when everything they loved stood threatened. Wren Callahan, Damien said, his voice low and steady despite the emotion visibly moving beneath it. I have existed for 3 centuries convinced that I had already experienced everything life, or whatever passes for it in a creature like me, had left to offer. I built an empire. I buried a mother I loved and a wife I never had the chance to find. And I told myself, somewhere along the way, that this was simply the shape my existence would always take, vast and cold and entirely alone at its center, regardless of how many people surrounded me. And then you walked into my study with your chin lifted and your voice steady, refusing to be intimidated by anything about this house or what lived inside it, and every careful wall I had spent 300 years constructing began, very quietly, to come apart. Wren's eyes had begun to sting, her throat too tight to speak, and she simply nodded for him to continue, unable to trust her own voice yet. You saved my father's life with nothing more than careful attention and a notebook full of observations that an entire staff of trained physicians failed to make, Damien continued. You offered your own blood to a man you had known for 3 weeks without a single moment's hesitation. You stood in a ruined kitchen and fought for your life rather than surrendering to a monster who believed you were simply an obstacle to be removed. And when it was over, you did not run from what you had learned about this family, about what we are and what we are capable of. You stayed. You have kept staying every single day since. And I find that I am no longer capable of imagining a version of my existence that does not have you standing somewhere in the middle of it. He released one of her hands and reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that he opened with careful, deliberate slowness, revealing a ring unlike anything Wren had ever seen. An old, dark stone set in silver that seemed, in the firelight, to hold some faint inner luminescence of its own. It belonged to my mother, Damien said quietly. She wore it for the better part of a century before she died, and my father has kept it safe in the years since. Waiting, he told me once, for a day he was not certain would ever come. I am asking you, Wren, not simply to stay as my father's caretaker, though I know he would be devastated to lose you in that role as well. I am asking you to stay as mine, as my equal, my partner, for as long as either of us exists in whatever form that takes. I love you. I do not say that lightly, and I have never said it to anyone in 300 years. Will you stay? Ren looked down at the ring, then up at Damien's face, at the raw, unguarded hope written across features that had once seemed carved from stone, and then past him to Augustus, standing by the fire with tears openly gathering in his own pale eyes. This strange, formidable, ancient family that had somehow, in the span of a few short months, become the only place in the world that felt entirely like home. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word, and then, laughing through the tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, of course. Yes. Before you'd even finished asking, I would have said yes." Damien slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled, just slightly, for the first time since she had known him, and when he pulled her into his arms afterward, lifting her briefly off her feet in a rare, unguarded display of pure joy, Augustus's laughter filled the library, warm and rich and entirely unlike the weak, rasping sound she had first heard from him months earlier in that enormous shadowed bed. "We shall need to throw a proper celebration," Augustus declared, wiping at his eyes with an expression of unrestrained delight. "The whole court will want to meet the woman who saved their king twice over. Once in body, and once, I suspect, in something considerably harder to heal. I insist on planning the menu myself, Ren, though I confess I intend to leave the actual cooking entirely in your capable hands. Some things, after all, should never change." Word spread through the family's wider circle in the weeks that followed with a speed that made clear exactly how significant the news truly was. Old allies and cautious rivals alike arriving at the estate to see for themselves the human woman who had, in the span of a single strange season, uncovered a century-old conspiracy, saved a king's father, and captured the heart of a man who had spent 3 centuries convinced his heart no longer functioned in any capacity worth mentioning. Ren met each of them with the same steady, unflinching composure that had carried her through every difficult moment since that first desperate email, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that she belonged among them in a way she had never quite belonged anywhere else in her life. A broken career, a desperate email from an agency that did not officially exist, a wrong diagnosis that 12 doctors and a lifetime of medicine had failed to catch. Ren Callahan came to that house looking only for a way to save her sister's life, and found, instead, a dying old man who needed someone who had not yet learned to give up on him, and a vampire king who had spent 3 centuries convinced he would never again let himself feel anything at all. Sometimes the family you save saves you back, in ways you never could have planned for. And sometimes the house you walk into as a stranger becomes, slowly and completely, the only place in the world that finally feels like home. Did Ren's stubborn refusal to give up surprise you as much as it surprised Damien? Let us know in the comments what you think finally broke through 3 centuries of a vampire king's carefully guarded heart. If you loved this story of quiet strength winning where 12 years of medicine and money never could, hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a slow burn worth waiting for, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale from the shadows. We'll see you in the next one.